Okay, well, with this video, I'm probably going to get some people that are going to disagree with me, say that I'm wrong, and I have not necessarily been wrong for the last 15 years, but I think the way that everybody looks at braking and how you should use your brakes on the track and where you should brake and which brakes you should use, a lot of people have it wrong in their head. And I think a lot of it is because the theory they're taking from comes from street bike racing. And dirt bikes are different than street bike racing. Street bikes, you do not steer with the rear. In motocross, you steer with the rear a lot. And everybody remembers Ryan Villapoto, and that was one of his big things, was steering with the rear end. We don't just follow our front end when we turn. As in street bike racing, when we brake, it's very heavy on the front brake, and it's a lot of the rear wheel following the front wheel. In motocross, very often your rear wheel is not following your front wheel. So when we think about braking, we've all heard the 80% front, 20% rear, 70% front, 30% rear, whatever you want it to be. That's correct, but it's also wrong unless explained correctly. And this is my belief, okay? If you disagree with me, put it in the comments, and I'll try to, I'm open, right? I'm always learning. I'm 41 and I'm still trying to figure things out in this sport. So as I'm doing stuff on my channel, it's just from what I'm learning and I'm just putting it out there. I have got to a certain point in my career. I made night shows in Supercross. I was a top 10 arena cross guy, top 5 sometimes. I got rookie of the year in arena cross in 2001. But you know what? I didn't make it as far as I would have liked to make it in this sport, but I am still trying to get better. And what led me on this little journey of rethinking my theory on braking and cornering and how you should do it is I did the World Vet last year and I went 10.8. And then this year I went 10.9. So basically, I got the same finish as last year. This year I was in far better shape. My bike was way more dialed in than last year. I only had about a week on the beta before last year's World Vet. I mean, I had my suspension dialed. Everything was great on my bike. You know what? And I finished in virtually the same spot. Same guys beat me. I beat the same guys. Still a good finish, but I want to be better. And I really don't have an excuse not to be better. So I started analyzing my riding and what I did wrong. And what I did was I watched the faster guys, Justin McDonald, who's from New Zealand. I went and watched him. I watched Mosman around the track, and I wanted to see what they did different. There was a certain part of the track before the finish line where I would, on the faster parts of the track, I would hang with the guys. But in the tighter, rutted, kind of fluffy berm spots, these guys were killing me. So I went and watched what they did. And what I noticed was they were off the front brake earlier than I was. And I grew up and I was taught to ride your front brake in every corner. And it'll keep you in the corner. It'll keep the front end settled. And when I was watching these guys, they weren't doing that. They were releasing the front brake and they were actually on the rear brake a little further into the corner than I would. I was the reverse. I was off rear first, trail the front into the corner. And I'm watching them and they're doing the reverse. They're off front, trailing the rear a little bit further into the corner. Sometimes they weren't on either brake.
Okay, so let's take a little break in the video here and I am going to show some footage of actual pros, top pros, doing what I am talking about. There's going to be a clip of me doing it, but I want to show that this is a technique that a lot of instructors are saying not to do, but a lot of pros are doing. And I don't believe it's a corner mistake. I've heard that, when they're riding the rear brake too far, and I've been guilty of saying this as well, that is a corner mistake. They made a mistake, so they're riding the rear brake. I don't believe that anymore. I think that riding the rear brake is very effective. And I remember a long time ago, Gary Semix said the rear brake was the most important brake on your motorcycle. Riding dirt bikes, the front brake is the most powerful, but he said learning to use the rear brake correctly is the most important. And I thought he was kind of crazy, and I've discounted that for a long time. But he's trained a lot of top professionals, and I'm starting to think that maybe he was right. All right, in this clip, I'm going to analyze Eli Tomac. This was when he first got on the Yamahas. But okay, he comes down. He's using both brakes, okay, front and rear. And right about here, he lets go of the front, but watch that right foot. He holds the rear brake till almost halfway through the corner. Right before he apexes that corner, he lets go of both brakes and gets on it. And then he comes in this next corner, holds front and rear till about the same point. Let's watch that in slow motion. Okay, front and rear. Front brake, let's go right about here, and rear brake as well. Right foot comes out. All right, and then the next one, we're gonna get a better view of that first corner we watched. But Eli Tomac, one of the fastest guys in the world, is what I'm talking about. So we can see there. All right, real time, you can't really catch it. Okay, front brake, rear brake, still on the rear, still on the front. Front is gone, but foot is still on the rear brake till right there, till almost 3/4 of the way through the corner. So he got off that front brake far earlier than he got off the rear brake. All right, in this next one here, we got Jason Lawrence, who I think was one of the best rear end steerers. Him and Villapoto, and they kind of were at the same time. All right, so we got front and rear brake use coming into the corner. He's using the front to slow himself down. But you can see here, let's go of the front, still on the rear, power slides the rear and steers with the rear end. So again, he let go of the front brake earlier, used the front brake to slow down his speed, but used that rear to stabilize the bike and for directional control. Jason Lawrence was really good at steering with the rear end. All right, here we have Jet Lawrence doing a little left-handed corner. Now let's slow it down and watch him. Front brake, rear brake, releases the front slightly before he releases the rear right there. Almost all the way through the corner, he's using that rear brake to settle the rear end and not rob him of speed. The front brake is so powerful. Let's watch it again. Front brake off the front right there, holding the rear just a little bit further, takes foot off, puts it back on the foot peg. He's utilizing that rear brake to his benefit, not using it too hard and just slightly dragging it to keep control of that bike and help that bike turn. All right, so here's some footage of Ken Roxon jumping through the whoops. Now look at that right foot. All the way to about halfway through that corner, he is riding the rear brake. Okay, so we're gonna jump. He's jumping through the whoops. All right, and then when he lands at the end, you can see him. All right, he uses the front brake to slow himself down, okay? And then now he's accelerating, but he has his foot on the rear brake through about 50 to 60% of that corner, just using it to help him stabilize the rear and go the direction he wants to go. Roxon was one of the fastest guys through that corner. And I saw some of the other pros, they were trying to use front brake only, and their bike was standing up, and it wasn't letting the rear end step out and steer through that corner like it should do. All right, again, here's another corner of Ken Roxon, okay? Look at how he comes in. Look at that, off the front brake about here, but that right foot is still on the rear brake. He's using that rear brake through the entire corner.
What is the difference between street bike racing and dirt bike racing? Like I said, the dirt bike racing, we steer with the rear. Street bike racing, the rear follows the front. So, do we drag the front or rear in a corner? If we are going to drag the front, which that is still effective, but I think that is overused. And I think that is my problem, is I am using that front way too far into the corners. And do a braking drill. Do a front brake only stopping drill and a rear brake only stopping drill. You will stop 10 times quicker with the front than you will with the rear. But if I'm sitting there and I'm going into every corner, every rut, and I'm dragging the front brake, I am killing speed. And everybody, the amount of drag you should have on your front brake is 1 to 5%. That is barely anything. I am guilty of this. I am guilty of using a quarter of the 25% pressure coming into the corners, and it just kills my corner speed and momentum. Go do a stop, do a stopping drill, and then go do a front brake only moto, and then go do a rear brake only moto. I guarantee your speed through the corners will be faster with the rear brake only. Will your entry speed be as fast? No, absolutely not. Okay, so you have to analyze, where do we use these brakes? The front should be used to rob your speed, to take the speed away when you're coming into corner, when your bike is virtually straight up and down. When you start to lean in, that's when we want to start letting go of that front brake. And if we do need to ride it, we need to vary slightly, like 1 to 5%, which is not that much pressure on the brake. And this is where I made my mistake, is I'd come into every corner and I'd be on that front brake. And I had a lot of stop and go motion going through my corners. As to where if I rode the rear brake through the corners, I was a lot more fluid. But in my mind, I didn't do that because I thought that was technically wrong and it was the wrong way to ride. But now I'm starting to realize, use the front. So here's where the 80%, 20% comes into play. I think a lot of people just rob that from street bike racing, and then they try to ride a dirt bike like a street bike, and it's not the same thing. 80% of your stopping power is in your front brake. So when you are hauling butt down a straightaway and you're trying to slow down for that corner, you got to use the front brake. And this is where beginners go wrong, because they will haul butt down a straightaway and then they'll slam on the rear and they'll do this all the way into the corner and shoot over the berm. All right. But if you watch pros, and this is another thing that's always baffled me too, is I see all these guys doing front brake only drills, ride with the front around the track, don't use the rear, get off the rear before the corner. And then I would go watch the nationals on TV and I'd see Jet Lawrence, Hayden Deegan, Joe Shimoda. And if you watch Joe Shimoda at the Motocross of Nations, he was riding the rear brake around the entire corner on his 450. Lightly, he was not locking up the wheel. And that's another point. If you're going to ride either brake, you do not want to lock them up. If you are riding your rear brake and you have full pressure on it, yeah, you're going to heat your discs up, you're going to heat your pads up, and you're going to lose your rear brake. But they're lightly riding them around every corner. I just watched the World Supercross last night. Watch Roczen and how far he lightly rides the rear brake. He lets go of the front first, but he lightly rides the rear brake around the corner. So I am just making this. I'm not saying to throw everything you know out the window. Give it a try though. Don't just do front brake only drills. Do rear brake only drills too. Do the whole track with rear brake only and just see which one you feel more comfortable around the corners. Because if you are riding your front brake too heavily through a rut, and in motocross we get bumps, okay? So what it's going to do, it's going to take your braking is going to squat your suspension and lock it basically. It's going to lock the suspension where it's at. If you're going through a rut and now you have your front end locked and you hit a bump, what's going to happen? That front wheel is going to come off the ground and there's no traction. It's not allowing the suspension to move. Wheel's going to go this way, tuck to the inside. So that's where you can go wrong with riding the front brake around corners. So another thing too is a lot of riders will pull the clutch in and then ride the rear brake, and you can hear them go around the corner, go around the whole entire corner. If you are going to ride the rear brake around the corner, it has to be very, very light pressure. It can't be heavy pressure. The lighter, the better. It's just enough to settle the rear end and get it to squat around the corner. And if you're not riding the front, it allows the front to free up, and that's where all your front end steering is from the front end. If you're sitting there grabbing your front brake around the entire corner, that wheel is going to lock up and it's going to make it very, very hard for you to corner. I put this to the test the other day. I went out on the track. I rode normal at first on our local track here. I did my normal way of riding, and then I did let the front brake. I was only using the front brake to slow my bike up straight up and down. As soon as I leaned in, I just let it go. I took my finger completely off of it. And my lap times were about 5 seconds faster on the track, just letting go of the front brake and not sitting there trying to manage it around the whole corner and use it around the entire corner. And if you guys don't believe me, go watch old videos of Jason Lawrence when he was on Yamaha Troy, and even when he was leading the Daytona Supercross, and watch how quickly he lets go of the front brake and he utilizes the rear brake. He was a very rear end steering type rider and used a lot of rear brake. He let go of the front. Most guys, it's hard to tell because they cover the front brake the whole time. So you can't tell if they're using it or if their finger's actually off of it. But he's a good one to watch because when he let go of the front brake, he was, full knuckle on the bars with no hand on the front brake at all. He carried a lot of momentum, almost won Daytona Supercross, won a couple titles or a title. Good one to watch though, just because if he can go that fast with, hand off the front brake, that's a good example. So this is something, I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe just kind of rethink the way you do corners, like I'm reanalyzing myself. And this may not be your issue, but I think that a lot of us have it so ingrained in our head to just use the front everywhere around the track. And Gary Semix had an old video back in the day where he said, what is more important, front or rear brake? And I watched this about 15 years ago. And I thought he was nuts. I'm like, this guy does not know what he's talking about for all rear brake. But look at the people he's trained. He has trained some of the best in the sport. And he talks about how the rear brake is more important than the front as far as, changing direction, backing it into a corner, steering with the rear. There's a lot of things that go into the rear brake. So don't sell yourself short. Don't listen to the people who just rob stuff from, street bike terminology and just say 80% front brake around the track, only 20% rear. Use the rear brake, but use it the correct way and find out what the correct way is. So here is the way, and this is how, when I have the kids that I teach, I have them do a rear brake only drill, I have them do a front brake only drill. They're typically faster doing the rear brake only drill. The front brake only drill, they know they can go faster down straightaways. On faster tracks, you might be a little faster with the front brake only drill because you can go so much faster down straightaways. This is the way you should do it. Front brake, and this is my new outlook on cornering in the sport. Front brake is your stopping power. That is what is going to slow you down. Once you tip in and lean in, you should try to let that front brake go, and it should only be, if you need to ride it, it should only be 1 to 5% pressure. You can still be on that rear brake, and sometimes you may let it completely go, just a little bit of pressure on that rear brake, light pressure to ride it into the corner, get it to settle, and then once you get right before the apex, let them both go. Let both the brakes, you should be completely off of them. You know, if you're having a little bit of trouble and you feel like you're going to pop out, well, yeah, you might have to ride a little bit further, but heavy braking, the 80% of your stopping power is in your front brake. It's not to be used 80% of the track around 80% of the corner. 20% of your stopping power is in your rear brake. That's why your rear brake doesn't stop you much. But just think of your front brake as the tool to slow you down. Think of the rear brake as the way you back it into the corner, the way you steer around the corner, the way you settle the rear end, the way you can back it out, you know, you can back it in and get at the angle of the berm as you're coming in. Another thing to be careful of, though, is do not get clutch happy. Don't start pulling in and then riding the clutch while you're on the rear brake and using that as a throttle control. And I've seen that numerous times, and people have glowing discs around the track because they're too heavy on the rear brake. But like I said, you can think I'm crazy, but this is just another way to analyze your riding. And, you know, I'm going to hopefully, you know, this will help my riding out, and I'll keep doing videos as I experiment with this, and then I'll get some actual real-time videos. But just a different way to think about riding. Don't get so caught up into the street bike terminology where it's all front brake. You know, front brake is important. That's the one that's going to slow you down and make sure you make the berm. But when you're in that corner, you know, sometimes maybe just a little light rear or no brakes at all. Just depends on how you come in. But I prefer, and I think it's better to use the rear to help you settle into that corner than the front. The front is just too powerful and robs too much of your roll speed and corner speed on corner entrance and lean in.